prosecutor and as a TV news producer, which I was very impressed by. And she's written a fantastic book on Hong Kong media law that is a very practical guide for media professionals in Hong Kong. Then Q is a professor at the University of Oregon. He holds the Jonathan Marshall First Amendment Chair at the School of Journalism and Communication. He has been in 2002. He's written an impressive amount of book chapters and articles, which have then been cited by lots of influential courts around the world. And his Twitter feed has been described as one of the most media and law resources on Twitter. So I plan to look at that daily. Both Q and Doreen will be speaking for about 15 minutes about the various threats that journalists could face and how to deal with those. First of all, I'll tell you a bit about Media Legal Defense Initiative. As I said, we're an organization based in London. We work across the world. We help journalists, bloggers, and media outlets who are in some form of legal trouble as a result of their. Any of it will be today. In 2014 and 15, we, for instance, defended around 600 journalists. We are mainly working in Africa and Asia. Lots of work in East Europe and then America. Our mandate, like I said, is quite broad, so both in topic and in territory scope. So, for instance, to give you an idea of our Asian work, we have, for instance, supported extradition cases in Malaysia. We have official secrets in Myanmar. We have helped journalists who were physically attacked in Indonesia. We have done cases on internet freedom in India, so it's very broad. We have also done litigation, so that means cases that are helpful not only to the country we bring them or to the region, but have a sort of right. One of the examples is a case at the African Human and People's Rights, in a case of Faso journalist was prosecuted on charges of criminal, and we managed to get a good judgment from the African court that says basically criminal criminal sanctions shouldn't be given to journalists for doing their job. So criminal like imprisonment or that should not be happening unless there is a case of hate speech or incitement to violence. So this case, for instance, we've recently seen that is being used to try to have criminal defamation law struck down there. So the effect of that is global. 79% success rate in our cases. So we we do yeah, exactly. But unfortunately, we'll get lots of applications. So there is still a lot of need for support. If you're in need of support, to me during one of the breaks, and I'll be happy to explain and help. Great. Then I will give the floor to Q.
Good morning. I'm delighted to have you all here for the wonderful, not necessarily more a conversation, dialogue. So we are here to talk with each other rather than talk to each other. So as indicated in the introduction, I am from the University of Oregon in the United States, but originally from South Korea. So it means, and I have a very first-hand experience with freedom of expression in the 1970s. Maybe I should say the lack of freedom of expression in South Korea. and some personal footnote. In the 1970s, I was a college student in I was involved in anti-government demonstrations in South Korea, not surprising. And not surprisingly, I was subject to some kind of personal governmental punishment. That's why I eventually served the Korean Army for almost 3 years in the 1970s. More importantly, today, we talk about the freedom of expression and the freedom of information, especially from an investigative journalism perspective. Freedom of information, more importantly in many ways, as compared with the freedom of expression, simply because once you have no access to information, there is no such a thing as freedom of expression. It means sharing information with the public. That's really important, not only in Asian countries, but around the world, especially in the United States. The most serious, challenging for not only regular journalists, but more often investigative journalists, has a lot to do with information. The public has every right to know. Of course, there are exceptions. The exception should be as narrowly defined as possible, simply because the assumption is the public, through media, should have the right to know. And the game is always in favor of the government rather than the public. And the vital role of investigative journalists is crucial. And that is why there is always between investigative journalists and the government. At the moment, right now, the United States is celebrating its 50th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Act. And we have to remember that the United States was not the first country to recognize freedom. Delayed means what? Information denied. There are more than 100, some people count, there are 113 or 116 countries which do recognize freedom of information as a constitutional right or as a statutory right. The number is increasing very impressively, especially in the past 20 years. The important question is, what kind of information is denied? What kind of information is released by the government? Often the information is denied largely because it is embarrassing to the government. So what is less is recognized in the United States, which is often recognized as the key of more press freedom rather than should learn from the rest of the world. I think now the serious issue facing investigation is whether even though the Supreme Court is recognized as constitutional and the statutory right. Now, the government is capable of tracking the news sources of journalist technology. These journalists has the technological know-how to track the news sources are used for the news report, and that is actually happening in the United States. So it means the American government doesn't have to demand or order journalists to provide to their companies those power for investigating the mind of crimes. If there's some kind of technology effect, of course, technological offenses are both valuable to journalists might know, hey, the government now, in some countries, is more than a generation. So sometimes just like the situations, especially those people who have money and who have power, want to use the dubious law. Not the poor may use larger claims or more superficial, but the legal claims. And the new media are sometimes going out of court. Sometimes new reports and editor are strategically targeted to make their lives miserable. That's because people who have money and people who have power wanted to let the people know that they can do what they want to make the form of that less than reality. That is the major law is not used in many countries. Now, I don't to check now privacy. Privacy is not as developed as the law, and maybe verify privacy is used as a way to add definition requirements. Especially when some people claim that their privacy right has been violated. The question is, so what is privacy? Even though something usually is related to privacy, the same privacy should be even more protection over freedom of expression. But privacy has a lot to do with our right to be special. It's true. But the question is, what's used? What is used enough to use power defense against the private claim? And the definition of useworthy is, different from society to society. The question is to define news as a, and if in some democratic country, when you see the definition of news is even better as compared with the government definition of news. Because the government wants to narrow the news to make people, as to make investigative reporters, more difficult to news report. So there are many of the issues I can touch on, but I just wanting to say of reporting is more importantly from an ethics perspective, because in legal issues are more or less as the result to think about ethical issues than legal issues. Because we think about accuracy, we also think about balance, and we also think about fairness, and so the thing about correspondence, especially when we talk about the local related news report. Right now we are living in a global process where you is affecting our country. So this is why sensitivity is more relevant now than ever. Finally, we have to think about the geographical population versus what is the right of it. Just because you have the right to publish does not mean you have the right to publish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll go straight to the room. Do you prefer to use this?
If it works. Okay. So, as Alinda mentioned, I had the great fortune to work in the New York Times. For many reasons, it was a paper. They had a edition of 10 journalists. They had a certain philosophy of having your journalists go through media law training sessions with lawyers. The point wasn't what you published, it was how to learn about the law so you know what you can publish. It's that affirmative action here. So, how many people here have been sued? My hands. organization, Civil Defense Initiative, help journalists. They do. I know many cases that refer to their organizations, and they do it in right of real ways. Everything from finding lawyers for them, finding funds for their cases, providing expertise, try to bring them into a case in Hong Kong. Unfortunately, the parties weren't as interested. We tried to get to do off the case, but it is an invaluable. And what's important about it focuses on this trend, not just regional, global network of resources and lawyers. You think about what would somebody in London know about my case? The fact is a lot of common issues. But yes, I do know in Asia, it's more than 30 countries, so many different things. So how do you let all together? I will give a second look to a panel I'm moderating this afternoon on information, freedom of information. And we have three very informed presentations on successful uses of freedom of information in Pakistan, and we discovered that 70% of all lawmakers didn't pay taxes. And then there was a story in India. India recently has passed its freedom of information law, and it's had quite a lot of success in using that. And then a presentation looked at trends throughout South Asia. And so you see some commonality of success stories there. But unfortunately, my jurisdiction in Hong Kong is one of failure stories. Hong Kong, a long, a sophisticated jurisdiction known for rule of law, freedom of expression, at least for the moment anyway. It does not have freedom of information law, and as a result, lots of information that you might take for granted in your particular community is not available in Hong Kong. Everything from multi-billion-dollar contracts to build Disneyland, those are not made available. Health studies on pollution effect on children, not made available. There are no archive laws, and so on. So that can really happen. So I hope you can come and share some of your stories on that. I guess, the point of the headline and title of this session was Bulletproofing Your Stories. Bulletproofing means you stop the bullet, right? Sometimes that can work, sometimes that doesn't. And so we can break down into several categories. One is content, and that's the more emotional area where you look at defamation, privacy, copyright, and so on. There's the news gathering, where it's not just the content of your material, but it's how you obtain that information. Did you use hidden cameras? Are you tracking? But then there's the affirmative way of using the laws of information right to obtain. Certainly there are issues that technology has brought. What are the laws involving drones, for example? Many communities, and I'd love to hear if some of you have stories on it, we certainly had that in Hong Kong, where they're issuing for the time regulations on the use of drones. And you say, well, how is drones being used? Certainly, did one program looking at the use of drones, how it was used by drones in a way, how you aware of opportunities, because that's a new great. And then third, differences. That is probably one of the biggest areas of new laws and litigation, and prosecutions actually, where what you publish in print, one set of laws go after it, but what goes on digital, what goes on in the laws. basically in its whole identity acting are journalists, people who oftentimes the laws have higher penalties than the traditional criminal defamation. Of course, civil defamation does not impose jail sentences. So those are the areas that you have to look at. Now, force protection, that's a difficult one, and a point raised by Q about how do you technologically, government doesn't need to go to you, they can bypass you. One of my favorite people in the world, how many people know who Jill Phillips is? Anyone know Gillian Phillips? How many people know The Guardian? Yeah, right. So The Guardian, Edward Snowden, you know, all these WikiLeaks stories that they've done. And so they've developed a whole protocol on everything. So it's not just using the laws or understanding laws, but you design a room. And then you have computers that have never been on the internet, okay? You find encrypted phones, you find all kinds of technological advances that you are doing to. But it even goes beyond that. I've had Jill, my journalists, and some of our out what to do if you're approached by a whistleblower. How many people here have been approached by whistleblowers? I want to hear those stories too. Who are you back there? You have been sued, you've been threatened, you've been approached by whistleblowers. What is your name? Okay, all right. So I look forward to you sharing some of your stories on this. It's true. And so he recommends that you have to do this certain type of interviewing and certain type of approach to not only yourself, but also to protect the source. Find out the identity. How do you verify the identity? Find out if this is disinformation. Oftentimes journalists are useful for disinformation. How do you verify the that's being given? So beyond the issue of protecting yourself from the laws, you're also protecting yourself as a journalistic institution and how you have to go about handling that. Okay, so the question is, all right, what are the laws? What are the laws I need to know? What are these bulletproof points I need to know? Stop writing. Because it depends where you are, what country you're in. Yes, it is true there are some general principles. What is defamation? Defamation is when you harm someone's reputation. When do you do that? You do any of the 3 I's. What are the 3 I's? You allege that someone is doing something illegal, right? Or you're alleging that someone is immoral. They're a liar. They're done something that may not be technically illegal, but something that holds them in public. Or you say they're incompetent, right? Anytime you do incompetent, illegal, immoral, ding, 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 these bells have to go in your head. But you're a serious journalist, and you're doing your work, right? And so you're saying, I've looked at this, I've done what I need to do. But sometimes it's the unintended consequence that gets you into trouble. You may have all your facts right, but somebody wrote a headline that wasn't quite matching, and with the headline, or the wrong photo, or the wrong line on the photo. Sometimes it boils down to a single word. There was a case in Hong Kong in which it was a pretty legitimate story. 1997 was coming. People didn't know this is the handover of a British colony of Hong Kong back to Chinese sovereignty. So up in the 1990s, there was a lot of concern of what's going to happen. Are the PLA troops coming across the border? So there was a big rush for immigration to other countries, to Canada, the UK, to Australia, to other places. So there were a lot of stories that were done about what was happening in these consulate offices and what was happening with visas and immigration documents. And so this newspaper story, and they talked about how somebody who was with a particular consulate was sacked and left this particular agency. Now, what does the word sacked mean? Does it mean they just left? Does it mean they were just let go? The whole focus on this one particular word. And if they had used just a more neutral word rather than the word sacked, the lawsuit would not have happened, right? Because the implication is that they were let for nefarious reasons, that he was at fault, that maybe there was a crime, maybe there was something else going on. You know, having that idea that you're using a fine-tooth comb. So one of the questions we had was, well, what do you do once you get to court? It's too late by then, right? You have to do this analysis and thinking about where you are before you get to that point. You have to think about, what am I writing about? What are some of the unintended consequences of what I'm writing? Do I have a defense? If I get sued, go through all that. You know you're writing about something controversial, so what might be my defense? Do I have to prove that it's true? If you have to prove that it's true, the evidence you have. That's where, you know, freedom of information comes in, right? You got the document, you have it, you're there, you're ready for it, right? What if you don't have the document? What else might suffice? If you can't prove that it's true, defenses. It's from a court case. That's privilege, so I know that I can be protected if I'm using court cases. What if it's some other privilege? It's something that came out of your legislature. So while it was going on, so that could be a privilege. So you need to know something that I like to call media literacy. You need to know about the law in your own jurisdiction, 100%. And how do you say, how do I learn this? Well, usually there is a book. Like when I came to Hong Kong, there was no book to write it. But most of your jurisdictions, and I've gone through your countries, so we have here Myanmar, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, India, Malaysia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Nepal, Vietnam, well, Vietnam, that's a tough one, Mongolia, China, and so on. And in countries, there are media law books. And Q has put together a really wonderful bibliography. I'm going to be adding on to that, where recommended books from various jurisdictions can be read them from top to bottom. Read court cases. Really begin to identify what are the important court cases in your particular jurisdiction. Are the court cases brought by public officials? Are they brought by private citizens? In Singapore, criminal cases, almost always civil cases, and who brings them? Well, it used to be Lee Kuan Yew, then it was his, family, anyone in the ruling party, and it's a civil case. They almost always win. In Hong Kong, it's bring cases again. You write about companies, right? So learn who brings those lawsuits, what are the likelihood, and what can I do? Not to stop from doing the story. Remember at the beginning, it's like, what can I learn, my knowledge, so that I can publish this story? What is it can I do that can bullet my particular case? How many of you have in-house lawyers that regularly do pre-publication review? Two. Lawyers. Get to know people who write laws. They look different. I still hear 10 years my students gone to become journalists and done a lot of things. We're happy to give it in advance before legal guidance in advance to know who the individuals are in your community. Okay, there are networks that are involved. One of the biggest trends happening right now are regional and global networks of legal help, exemplified by MLDI, but there are other groups as well. Go to the Bar Association, find out who are outspoken legal experts that first you want to interview them, but also people who you can use as resources in the end. Talk to each other. One that was quite successful going beyond learning from lawyers is doing collaborative work. But outside your community, then you're pulling your resources. Maybe you don't have a lawyer, but they have a lawyer. And that way you are trying to protect your work. I mean, I can go into a lot more specifics with you, or if some of you are coming to the media law about specific cases, but I want to talk about just a couple more things and then open it up for Q&A. So we talk about what to do to protect yourself, how to prevent going to court, talk about what to do once you're in court, so forth. My third idea is, when should you go to court on your own? When should you be an action? That is something that's happening more and more. Alinda talked about litigation as an organization, an international organization. But there are things that you as a journalist can do. The obvious example is freedom of information. After you deny it, then you go to court, you bring action. But there are other things as well. Again, go back to GIJN. They've been successful in doing this. For example, when Miranda was charged or held for violating anti-terrorism law, allegedly, and there were some cases they got really involved. So later on, another extradition case, and they decided to step in as a news organization and challenge the secrecy of that information. That you need to know what it is, and they did get partial victory on that case. We've been looking for cases in Hong Kong to challenge the secrecy of court documents, which are not included in a lot of FOIA legislation. How many people here have courts that would have restrictions on your access to court? Yeah, there's a few here, right? So when you look for that test case, you look for the case that has strong public interest, that has the support of the parties, and then you bring challenges, and you'll often find pro bono lawyers who want help bring cases. And so you think along those lines. We had a case in Hong Kong where it was where online journals were denied accreditation as regular journals were then to go. These salons, Central Hong Kong, protest 18 one day, protest out of line, not even the same time as traditional journalists were, and so now they're lost. They challenge that. So these are particularly your jurisdiction that users have to pay a court cost, but oftentimes court will be generous. The generous employer who's willing to help take the rest, you might be able to find legal counsel to help that. There are resources to go to. So, but a sea change happening in the last several years around the world, and absolutely in India, and that is the increasing willingness on the part of government to treat speech as crime, whether it's sedition, Asia, whether it's, and unfortunately the horrible High Court ruling, Supreme Court ruling in India on criminal defamation. I mean, that is a crime, what happened there. And I know many lawyers who were quite sickened by that decision. And of course, people were hoping and praying for a different approach to that. And something that, requires us as journalists, as lawyers, as advocates, to be more proactive. The beginning is sharing our stories, sharing our stories with each other. Conferences like this will help us build a pool of information, a body information, where we can learn strategies that work with some people, can work with others. So hopefully we'll begin and continue that dialogue here. Anyway, I've spoken too long. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Doreen. We've got approximately minutes for questions. So if there are any questions in the room, please stand up and introduce yourself and also tell us which organization you work with. Paranjoy.
Thank you. I'm the editor of the Economic and Political Weekly in India. I want to take off from where you ended. Recently, the Supreme Court of India, a two-judge bench, ruled that defamation is both a civil offense as well as a criminal offense. Some of us said that you can have defamation as a civil offense, but it should not be a criminal offense. How judges of the Supreme Court of India ruled that the right to reputation is as important as the right to freedom of expression, and some could even interpret that judgment to reputation is perhaps more important than the right to free expression, which is a right according to the Constitution of India. What do you think should be the strategy now of those who disagree with the judgment? And the same judge, a very unusual development, in another occasion observed in court justifying his earlier judgment. What would you say should be the way forward to those who are opposed to this judgment? We have a system of appealing to a higher bench, from a two-judge bench to a five-judge bench. I think that would probably be a good course of action.
Thanks, Paranjoy.
The first thing I would do is contact this lady here, because they've had success in other countries of dealing with this issue. You have to be strategic, and that's key here. You have to look at, it's not in a vacuum. You look at that particular court. You look at the judges, you look, is it a more conservative court? Who are the judges? What prior rulings are? What is precedent and so forth? And what is the likelihood of success? And you can kind of shape that in a way that will most appeal to that particular court. Totally legitimate and so forth, but it can help structure it. For example, there was a case, Ying Chan, who's sitting here in the front row here, a few years ago in Taiwan, a criminal defamation case. And she was able to raise public awareness and got an international team of lawyers helping her with the case in Taiwan, even though people said, don't go, what if you're convicted? Did. And the argument was, trying to import certain cases and ideas, but not necessarily distributing them at New York Times Sullivan or whatever, finding what pushes the buttons of those particular. So sometimes it takes kind of an outside view of things to be more strategic. The second thing is, and this is harder, and that is, and this is what happened in the UK, where they got their defamation reform. They couldn't get it through the courts. The courts just kept, bumbling, and it just wasn't taking into account what was happening on the internet and so on. They were able to build a public campaign to change the law, right? So that's the other approach, using advocacy to get the law actually changed. And in that case, they had a sympathetic defendant, actually not technically a journalist, he was a science writer, but totally great reputation, not, sensational, all of that. And they built this public campaign, and a lot of people got behind it. And then, you also have to have kind of the right alchemy of, the right moment in politics, the right moment happening, but you can build a campaign that way. That's a much longer road, obviously. But it doesn't have to be one approach or the other either. You can kind of take different approaches for that. But it's not over yet, right? So perhaps forward, but there has to be a concerted effort to move forward on this approach. That's my advice.
Great. Maybe to add to that, an example from our work. So I mentioned the African court judgment on criminal defamation. There have been many, many cases in which we've tried to use that judgment in order to have some progress at the national level as well. So, for instance, we received an application from Kenya at some point where a reporter who was criminally prosecuted or involving a government official, saying that the government official had been spotted crying for 20 minutes. This was sufficient to subject him to criminal prosecution. So we thought sympathetic journalist, defendant in this case, let's help these people build a bigger team than they would normally have. So they already had a lawyer that, but they couldn't afford him. He was very good media lawyer in Kenya. So they came to us and we covered his legal fees, for instance. Contacted the lawyer and worked with him to see what kind of case law would, for instance, be helpful in the Kenyan courts. Do Kenyan courts care about what happens in the UK or in the US? Or do they think that's not interesting at all? Do they care about what the Inter-American Court has said or what the European Court has said? So we worked with the lawyer to see what would be helpful, basically. So sometimes link local lawyers to international lawyers who have experience in similar cases but in a different jurisdiction, and see if they can work together to improve the case, for instance. So basically it's waiting for the right case to come along. Just try again. Apply for support. We're always happy to help. And we can build a team and get you the research that you need to take this further. Hugh, would you also like to respond?
I say when it comes to the never-ending confrontation between criminal and civil defamation, at least the unmistakable trend globally is that there is more argument in favor of civil defamation rather than criminal defamation. Of course, interests pursued by civil versus criminal defamation are very different, but generally speaking, when we talk about the freedom of expression as a human right, the better balance between freedom of expression versus relational interest is that criminal defamation should not be used, and it is often abused by government officials or for those who happen to have a lot of money to punish, sometimes vindictively, those who disagree with those powers that be. So I say at least we can say, as a matter of international global trend, criminal defamation should be out, civil defamation should be in. There's a little bit more a common way freedom of expression as a right.
Let's talk afterwards, because there are people who are active in the area in your country, and I can put you in touch with some of them as well, who are trying to respond to how to go further on this. The disadvantage here in Asia is that we're the only place that doesn't have an Asian, human rights court, right? We don't have that regional court. Africa has its, Inter-America has the European Court of Human Rights. So many of the great freedom of expression cases have come out of the regional human rights courts. So Asia doesn't have, so that's a big handicap here. So then, going back to what Alinda said, then you have to think more strategically. What does your domestic national court value? What jurisdiction do they look to? Who do they cite? Because I know India does not just use Indian cases. They do look internationally. How to use kind of a bigger pool of thinkers on it to see what you can do to move that case forward. Yes?
I just wanted to add 1 or 2 points. Take me half a minute. There's the beginning of a movement to start advocacy. There is a member of parliament who intends moving a private member's bill to amend the law. And the beginning has made, and I just thought to use the argument on stage, a lot of references made to law across the world. Clearly, two judges not moved.
It's a long process. Any other
business and detention.
Once a journalist, always.
That's not one way. The issue of business and introduced by the is Bangkok, looking under the ASEAN countries in both those cases. The border between journalism work and research work done by NGOs, the organization of various countries, times not technical journalists, they are doing investigation. In any case, both journalists and other organizations have been targeted by campaigns and the UK information. There is two issues. One, the economic issue, basically, most of them have to do with the bail and cases of criminal defamation, and also the commercial remedies, which one such both sides are put in danger of the future of the media or organizations. Any tool that none of use in terms of putting resources or spike the issue of the economic threat that was posed to an organization. And West, the end of if you like to
so if I understand your question, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear from the microphone because I got a little feedback on that. Is you're asking, are there resources to help in Southeast Asia? Okay, here's Ms. Mondax over here.
So if one organization is not able to cover that type of data needed. So we had instances in this where friends program received crippling damages award, and they had to think very creatively about how to go about it. So obviously there are methods that you can do training. You can then if you track and so them against it as low as possible. But let's say all that fails. What this blog that I was referring to was a crowdfunding a page. Basically, he had massive presence on social media, so he reached out to everyone. He involved many NGOs in the region, but also in Europe and the US. Called Care Store and case of I worked as a nurse and working in free time, and he was sued by the Prime Minister in Singapore. But I decided for you NGOs across the world, and he tended to raise quite a lot of funds and for not that just I think at least substantial parts that have done quite well. There's a question in the back there.
I work for a European-wide agency. My question is all of you. I'm listening to this very interesting debate of law, legal issues, law, legal, all of that. Now, in India, increasingly lawyers are telling journalists not to write. The lawyers are telling publishers not to write books. And it's very, very dangerous. And if you look at like journalism, old school journalism, source-based journalism, the virtually die, that's actually die. So what's the advice? I first pick up all my sources, them from a lawyer, giving my year 45, and then write a copy, and that's my deadline. So I'm a little worried that if I go ahead and scoop up a story, then I work clockwise to defend myself in the court, and that's a serious problem. We all face it. In India, the public, we are not discussing it here, they have virtually clamped down on all writers, telling them not to write. As a result of which, journalists are now forced to raise their own money, funding, and then printing their book and even marketing it. What's your answer to that? Thank you.
Baron Joy, do you have an answer to this? Exactly. Baron Joy, would you like to respond?
It's easier today, thanks to technology, to become your publisher. But the resources that large organizations have in terms of money and human resources, financial resources to market and publish can very rarely be matched by an individual. So that's the trend that we all suffer from. And the other problem is everybody wants everything free on the internet. So when my book was recently pirated, and a friend of mine said, "Hello, I got your book." I said, "On your Kindle, how much did you pay?" He says, "I got it for free." So I told my publishing associate, "What can we win?" And he told me, "Congratulations, be proud. Your book is popular, therefore it's been pirated." So I really don't know, and I completely agree with what Shantanu said. If I listened to my friend in the legal fraternity, then I just wouldn't have been able to do what I did.
Yeah.
It's like a situation.
Yes.
I want to say maybe you guys are legends. You can answer me.
I'm very flattered. You call us legends, but I'm afraid I wouldn't know.
Okay,
Yes.
my name is Ushinor. I work with Outlook Magazine in Delhi, in India. So I would just like to respond to both these gentlemen because I'll agree with what you're saying. Because I mean, of course, the advantage is I'm a lawyer turned journalist, so I practiced law before to journalism. That helps in one way. But I also have, let's say, a group of very senior lawyers who I turn to vet my stories on a regular basis. And it does not actually hold me back. They take between 1 evening to 2 evenings to get back to me. They often tell me what can become indefensible in a court of law. You know, and that's very important because there are certain things that we often write which can become indefensible. There are these certain lines, as you were correctly saying, it's always the text or the copy that you're writing. You know, it's this little slug that goes in. It's this little headline that sneaks in something else that you never really intended to say, which people might think condenses into an idea which you're copying. You know, that's not for you to write, that's for somebody to assume. So you shouldn't be pushing those ideas. So it's always great to do it, and it doesn't take long. And you have every right to reject the lawyer's advice if you feel that, okay. It's like a disclaimer. It's a legal disclaimer. He's telling you that, see, if you write this, this is what, these are laws that you could violate. Because even though I myself used to be a lawyer, I'm not really in touch with the law on a regular basis. I don't read law journals every weekend. I don't really know what's happening. So then there will be a lot of case laws, there will be a lot of new judgments which say new things about things that you're writing. So therefore, are you protected enough? He's going to point it out to you. And maybe consult more than one lawyer.
But there's a point here. I mean, Ushino being a lawyer turned journalist, I zoo reporter journalist is a difference, number one. All journalists don't have
Could you use the
lawyer
microphone,
friend.
please, so we can hear you properly?
So I'm saying he's an advantage to his credit that he's a lawyer turned journalist. Now, all journalists across the world don't have that kind of advantage when they go and dig stories. Investigative stories, normally you actually venture into a zone. So somewhere down the line, I think when you investigate whatever you get, the first story comes out invariably draws legal repercussions. So that's what my question is. Do I actually fortify myself first and then write a copy? Investigate first and then try to defend it?
Okay, I have the answer for you on that one. Okay, and that is you have to get the knowledge as well. That has to inform you. That's the way I teach my students. I first teach them, I was a journalist first, then became a lawyer, then became a prosecutor, but my love and my heart has always been in advancing journalism. So the way I teach them, first learn about law. I mean, I take them to court, I have them meet judges, I take them to the library, I teach them how to do their own legal research. It's all about capacity building. I'm you're going to become as expert as somebody who specializes in this area. But once you get the basic principles down, you know where the landmines are. So don't step on those. That might protect you, but sometimes it could be, as I said, the one word or adjectives. You know, like there's a major news organization that doesn't allow the, reporters to use adjectives, because that's what always gets into trouble. The terrible, the horrible, the this or that. You know, it's just stick with the facts, be neutral on it. Still report it, but be clear about how you use that. And once you begin to see and what are the triggers, then that becomes a part of your mentality of what you can do to avoid landmines. It doesn't mean that if you have a perfectly, you know, shaped story and you've done all, you know, crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's, you don't get sued, but at least you know where the likelihood is going to be. Now, sometimes it's about who you write about, right? Sometimes it's an individual who's always bringing the lawsuit. Sometimes it's about corporations who don't like what you're revealing. And that's just going to be a fact. We're going to have to make that value judgment. Is this still a very important case to do? And that's an assessment that the lawyers have all decided for. A lot of companies saying, well, we can't take any chance. We take zero chance. But journalism isn't about that. The journalism is about taking, you know, putting yourself out there and doing it, but at the same time understanding what it is that you need to know as a journalist. So I have to challenge that. I think that every journalist should aware and have this media law literacy so that you understand where some of those landmines are. You're not the expert for sure, but it will form and shape your daily reporting and coverage so that you can facilitate reporting, not to stop it.
Thanks, Doreen. We're running a little bit late, so we have time, because we started late as well, we have time, I think, for one more question. I've seen the lady in the back there raise her hand a couple of times.
Okay, thanks. I'm Martha Mendoza with AP, and I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about Andy Hall's case, defamation case in Thailand.
Sorry, which case?
Andy Hall was convicted and found guilty a few days ago in Thailand for defamation, sentenced to 4 years.
I'm sorry, I did hear about that. I'm not as up on the details of what is going on right now.
I guess a question for reporters in Thailand is, has the tide turned? So,
yes.
And what does that mean for reporters in Thailand in terms of a defamation law that's pretty broad?
You know, it's not just Thailand. It's happening all over Asia, where they're being increasingly aggressive for local journalists, for foreign journalists. It's happening in China, you know, where they're being expelled. And I mean, there was a new report that is just come out, or is just about to come out, that talks about the difficulty of journalists in China, where they're having, they actually made a foreign journal do the forced confession on CTV, but it's come quite close. So it's a tough one. It's a tough question. I want to know a little bit more what's going to happen with the case further, but I'm not surprised by it, because there's been an increasing trend in this area, not just in Thailand, but in Asia, unfortunately.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Doreen and Q, for your wonderful talks. We will, all three of us, will be around for the next few days. We'll do the media law clinic, as Doreen said, on Saturday afternoon. So please all join us with any other questions you may have, or come find us during the lunch or any of the other breaks. Thank you.